We live in a world that seems to celebrate the loud, the bold, and the super outgoing, right? But what about the other half of us? Today, we're taking a deep dive into introversion, not as some kind of weakness you need to fix, but as a quiet, powerful, and honestly a scientifically fascinating way of being.
For literally centuries, this one idea from Aristotle has been a massive cornerstone of Western thought. It basically suggests that our default setting, our natural state, is to be social. And you can see this ideal baked into everything, from our open plan offices to our classroom participation grades.
But hang on, that raises a really interesting question. If being a social animal is the secret sauce for success, why do about a third to a half of us identify as introverts? From a purely evolutionary standpoint, shouldn't that trait have been, well, weeded out by now? That is the mystery we are going to unpack today. To get to the bottom of this, we first have to figure out where this intense pressure to be an extrovert even came from. How did the man of action become the gold standard? And what did we value before all that? Well, according to author Susan Cain, America went through this huge transformation. Back in the 19th century, we lived in what she calls a culture of character. What really mattered was who you were in private, your integrity, your honor. But then, as big cities and big business exploded in the 20th century, we shifted to a culture of personality. All of a sudden, being able to make a quick, charming impression on total strangers became absolutely crucial for success. And that shift gave rise to what King calls the extrovert ideal. It's this subtle, everywhere message that the best version of yourself is outgoing, assertive, and totally comfortable being the center of attention. And that puts this immense, unspoken pressure on anyone who's naturally more quiet or reflective. Okay, but before we go any further, we have to clear up this single biggest misconception about introversion. And trust me, this distinction is absolutely crucial. So here it is, the big takeaway. Introversion is not the same thing as shyness. Shyness is all about the fear of social judgment. Introversion, on the other hand, is all about energy. It's simply a preference for environments that aren't so overwhelming. An introvert can be a totally confident public speaker, but afterwards, you can bet they'll feel completely drained and need some quiet time to recharge their batteries. So if it isn't fear, what is it? Well, the real answer to our big question, why do introverts even exist, lies deep inside our biology. It all comes down to what's happening inside the brain. Way back in the 1960s, a psychologist named Hans Eysenck came up with this really groundbreaking theory centered on something called cortical arousal. The easiest way to think about it is like your brain's natural volume setting, its baseline level of alertness. And Eysenck believed this is where the fundamental difference between introverts and extroverts begins. So an introvert's brain is naturally set to high alert. This means it has a low threshold for stimulation. It doesn't take much, like a loud party or a busy office, for them to feel over-aroused and totally overwhelmed. They actually perform their best in quieter settings. Extroverts, they're the exact opposite. Their brains have a high arousal threshold, which means they actually need more stimulation from the outside world to feel awake, engaged, and at their best. And it goes even deeper, right down to our brain chemistry. Research shows that introverts are actually more sensitive to dopamine, that reward chemical in our brains. For them, a little bit goes a very long way, which is why a quiet evening with a book can feel just as rewarding as a huge party. Extroverts, on the other hand, have a less sensitive dopamine reward network. That's what drives them to seek out bigger thrills, more social events, more risks, to get that same feel-good rush. Okay, so we know it's biological, but what's the evolutionary advantage? How did this quiet trait actually manage to survive through the ages? Well, the answer might come from an evolutionary biologist named David Sloan Wilson. His research shows that across the entire animal kingdom, survival isn't about having one single best strategy. It's about having a balance of two different but equally valid approaches. He calls them the rovers and the sitters. The rovers, who are a lot like our extroverts, are the bold explorers. They're the ones who rush into new environments, looking for new food and new opportunities. They take big risks, hoping for big rewards. And then you have the sitters, our introverts. They're more cautious. They hang back, they observe carefully, they process all the information, and they conserve their energy. They're the ones who spot the dangers. And here's the thing, a group needs both to survive. Without the risk-taking rovers, the tribe might starve. But without the cautious sitters, the tribe might get eaten by a predator. So, far from being a disadvantage, introversion comes with its very own set of superpowers. That tendency to sit back and observe, that leads to the deep focus you need for creativity and complex problem solving. Studies even show that introverts often make exceptional leaders because they listen more and empower their teams to shine. And their natural sensitivity can lead to a strong conscience, deep empathy, and the ability to form fewer, but much more profound relationships.
Understanding the science is one thing, but how do we actually apply it to our lives? Whether you're a hardcore introvert, a total extrovert, or somewhere in between, the key is learning how to manage your own energy. So let's look at a really practical tool for doing just that.
The concept is called a restorative niche. Professor Brian Little came up with this idea, and it's basically any place, time, or activity that you deliberately use to get back to your true self. For an introvert who's been acting extroverted at a conference all day, finding a restorative niche isn't a luxury. It's an absolute necessity to recharge. And creating one for yourself is actually pretty simple. First, you identify what drains you. Maybe it's back-to-back Zoom calls or crowded networking events. Second, you find what recharges you, a quiet walk, listening to music, reading a book, whatever it is. And finally, and this is the most crucial part, you have to actually schedule it. Block out time in your calendar for your restorative niche, just like you would for any important meeting, especially before or after an activity you know is going to be draining. So, in the end, introversion isn't a flaw. It's just a different and equally successful evolutionary strategy. It's a quiet strength. The real question isn't how to change who you are, but how to understand your own wiring and build a life that plays to your advantages. So, I'll leave you with this. How will you design your day to harness your own unique strengths?